The crash happened at 3:47 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I was checking my watch, annoyed that Yasin was late coming home from school. The call came 17 minutes later. "Your son has been in an accident?" The words hit me like cold water. I dropped the phone twice, trying to get my keys, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't grip anything properly. The drive to the hospital was a blur of honking horns and red lights that I ran without thinking. I kept repeating the same prayer over and over, the familiar Arabic words falling from my lips like stones. When I reached the emergency room, they led me down a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and something else I couldn't name. Something metallic and wrong. Yasin lay unconscious on the narrow bed, tubes snaking from his small body like the roots of some terrible tree. His face was swollen, purple around the eyes, but peaceful, almost serene. "He's stable for now," the doctor said, his voice carefully neutral. "But the next 72 hours will be critical." I pulled a chair close to his bedside and opened my Quran. For 3 days, I read to him every verse I knew by heart, every prayer that had ever brought me comfort. The familiar rhythm of the Arabic should have soothed me, should have filled the terrible silence with something holy. Instead, the words felt hollow, like echoes bouncing off empty walls. Other families came and went. I watched them pray in different languages, heard them whisper names I didn't recognize. One nurse, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, would stop by our room several times each shift. She never said much, just checked Yasin's monitors and touched my shoulder gently. "I'm praying for your boy," she whispered on the second night, when exhaustion had made my voice too hoarse to read aloud anymore. I should have thanked her politely and left it at that. Instead, something desperate in my chest made me look up at her. "What do you pray?" She paused, her hand still resting on my shoulder. "I asked Jesus to hold him." The name hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to correct her, to explain that we had our own prayers, our own protection. But the words wouldn't come, because in that moment, looking at my son's still face, I realized something terrifying. My prayers felt like they were disappearing into nothing, like God wasn't listening anymore. That night, alone in the dim hospital room, I found myself thinking about the nurse's words. Jesus to hold him. What did that even mean? And why, when she said it, did something deep in my chest flutter like a bird trying to escape? I told myself it was nothing, but my soul had already started whispering otherwise. On the third morning, Yasin opened his eyes, just for a moment, but it was enough to make my heart leap against my ribs. I leaned forward, gripping his small hand in both of mine. "Habibi, can you hear me?" His eyes found mine, unfocused but aware. His lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. I pressed my ear close to his mouth, holding my breath. "He's here," Yasin whispered, his voice like paper rustling. "Who's here?" "The doctor." But his eyes had already closed again, and the machines resumed their steady beeping. I sat back in my chair, my hands trembling. The doctors said confusion was normal after head trauma, that patients often said strange things as their brains healed. But something about the way Yasin had looked at me, like he was seeing something just over my shoulder, made my skin crawl. That afternoon, the head of our mosque arrived with 3 other elders. They filled my small space with their deep voices and certainty, reciting prayers with the kind of authority I used to possess. I tried to join them, but the Arabic felt thick on my tongue, foreign somehow. Allah tests those He loves most, Brother Mahmoud said afterward, his heavy hand on my back. Your faith will be rewarded. I nodded because it was expected, but the words sat in my stomach like stones. Where was the reward in watching my 12-year-old son fight for each breath? Where was the love in this sterile room that smelled of death and disinfectant? After they left, I found myself staring at the cross hanging on the wall opposite Yasin's bed. I'd noticed it before, but never really looked at it. Now it seemed to catch the afternoon light, throwing shadows that shifted and moved as clouds passed over the sun outside. That evening, when the kind nurse came to check on Yasin, I found myself studying her face. There was something in her expression when she looked at my son. Not pity, but something else. Something that looked almost like hope. You said you pray to Jesus, I said suddenly, surprising myself with my directness. She paused in adjusting his IV drip. Yes. What? What do you think he does? It was a dangerous question. As an Imam, I knew the theological arguments, the proper responses, but I wasn't asking as an Imam anymore. I was just a father watching his child slip away. She considered my question carefully, her hands still busy with the medical equipment. I think he holds us when we can't hold ourselves anymore. Something cracked open in my chest at those words. I'd spent 15 years teaching others about Allah's mercy, about divine love and protection. But sitting in that hospital room, watching my son's shallow breathing, I felt utterly alone, like I was falling through empty space with nothing to catch me. Does he listen to people like me? The question escaped before I could stop it. The nurse's eyes met mine, and I saw no judgment there, no surprise, only kindness that made my throat tight. I believe he listens to everyone, she said quietly, especially fathers who love their sons. After she left, I sat in the growing darkness, afraid to turn on the lights, afraid of what I might see in my own reflection in the window. The cross on the wall had faded into shadow, but I could still feel it there, like a presence watching over us. For the first time in my adult life, I found myself thinking about a name I'd been taught to respect, but never to call upon. A name that seemed to hover at the edges of my consciousness, like a whisper I wasn't ready to hear. The air felt heavier that day, as if something was about to ask me a question I wasn't ready to answer. On the 4th day, something shifted. I felt it the moment I walked into Yasin's room that morning. A heaviness in the air, like the pressure before a storm breaks. The monitors were beeping faster, and his breathing had changed, becoming shallow and irregular. The doctor pulled me aside in the hallway, his face grave. We need to prepare for the possibility that... He couldn't finish the sentence, but I understood. The machines were keeping my son alive, but barely. His brain activity was declining. The injuries were too severe. I returned to the chair beside his bed, my legs unsteady. This couldn't be happening. Not to Yasin. Not to my perfect, brilliant boy who could recite the Quran like an angel and asked questions that made my heart swell with pride. I opened my prayer book with shaking hands, but the words blurred together on the page. Bismillahir-Rahman-ir-Rahim, I began, but my voice cracked halfway through. The familiar verses that had once flowed like water now felt like gravel in my throat. I tried again, forcing myself to concentrate, to find the peace that prayer had always brought me. Nothing. The words hung in the air like dead things, meaningless sounds that echoed off the hospital walls. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool air conditioning. This wasn't right. Prayer was supposed to be my refuge, my strength. It was what I taught others to lean on when everything else failed. But now, when I needed it most, it felt like speaking into a void. I closed the book and sat in silence, watching Yasin's chest rise and fall with mechanical precision. His face looked so young, so innocent. There were still traces of childhood softness in his cheeks, a small scar on his chin from when he'd fallen off his bicycle last summer. How could this broken body contain the same boy who had laughed at my terrible jokes just a week ago? Around midday, Yasin's eyes fluttered open again. This time, they were clearer, more focused. He looked directly at me, and I saw recognition there that made my heart leap. "Baba," he whispered, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "I'm here, Habibi. I'm right here." He tried to lift his hand, and I caught it in mine, feeling how small and fragile his fingers were. "I saw him again," he said, so quietly I had to lean in close to hear. "Saw who, son?" "The man in the light. He has kind eyes." Yasin's gaze drifted to something beyond me, beyond the room. "He knows my name. Baba, not the name you gave me. My real name." Ice ran down my spine. "What are you talking about? Your name is Yasin. I named you after the blessed surah." But he was shaking his head slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's what you call me here. But he calls me something else, something beautiful." "Who calls you something else?" My voice was sharper than I intended, fear making me sound angry. Yasin's eyes met mine again, and in them I saw something that terrified me. Peace. Complete, absolute peace. Like nothing I'd ever seen in his 12 years of life. Like nothing I'd ever felt in my 43 years of existence. "He says he's been waiting for me," Yasin continued, his words coming in soft bursts between breaths. He says you know him too, but you've forgotten his voice." "Stop." The word escaped me like a prayer, desperate and pleading. "Stop talking like this." But Yasin wasn't listening to me anymore. His gaze had turned toward the window, where late afternoon sunlight was streaming through the blinds, casting golden bars across his hospital bed. His breathing was becoming more labored, but his expression remained serene. "He's calling me home, Baba," he whispered. "But he wants you to know. He wants you to know he loves you too." The monitors began beeping faster, more urgently. Nurses rushed in, but their movements seemed to happen in slow motion, like I was watching from underwater. All I could focus on was my son's face, the way the light seemed to gather around him, making his skin glow. "Yasin, stay with me," I pleaded, gripping his hand tighter. "Don't leave me." He turned his head toward me one last time, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, carrying more certainty than I'd ever heard from anyone. "Jesus," he said, the name falling from his lips like a song. "Jesus, I'm coming." And then he was gone. The room erupted in controlled chaos as medical staff tried everything they could, but I knew it was over. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at my son's peaceful face, his final word echoing in my mind like thunder. Jesus, a name I'd never taught him, a name we'd never spoken in our home, a name that now burned in my chest like a brand, impossible to ignore or forget. That moment cracked something open in me. I didn't know what it meant, but what came next? I was not ready for it. The funeral was held 3 days later. Our mosque overflowed with people who had come to pay their respects to the Imam's son, the boy who had recited Quran like an angel. I stood beside his small grave, accepting condolences with a numb smile, shaking hands that felt like shadows against my skin. "He is with Allah now," they said. "He is in paradise. Inshallah, he will intercede for you on the day of judgment." What a blessing to have raised such a pure soul. Each word felt like sand in my mouth. I nodded and thanked them because it was expected, because it was what I had always done when comforting other grieving families. But inside, something had broken apart the moment Yasin spoke that name. I couldn't shake the image of his face in those final moments. The certainty, the peace, the way he'd looked at something I couldn't see. After everyone left, I remained alone beside the fresh earth. The afternoon heat pressed down on me like a weight, but I couldn't move. I kept replaying his last word, the way it had sounded so natural falling from his lips, like he'd been practicing it in secret, like it belonged to him. How was that possible? Where had he learned it? I'd raised him in our faith from birth, surrounded him with Arabic prayers and Quranic verses. We'd never owned a Bible, never watched Christian programs, never allowed such influences in our home. I'd been careful about that, protective. Yet somehow, in his final breath, my son had called on a name I'd never given him permission to know. That night, I sat in his bedroom, surrounded by his things. His prayer rug lay folded at the foot of his bed. His collection of books, mostly religious texts I'd chosen for him, lined the small shelf by his window. Everything exactly as he'd left it, waiting for a boy who would never come home. I picked up his notebook, the one where he practiced his Arabic letters. Flipping through the pages, I found his homework assignments, his careful attempts at calligraphy, notes from our evening lessons. But near the back, I discovered something that made my blood freeze. Sketches, crude drawings that only a child would make, but unmistakable in their meaning. A figure with outstretched arms, light radiating around a man's silhouette. And at the bottom of one page, in Yasin's careful handwriting, "He says he loves me." My hands shook as I turned the pages. More drawings, more words. The man in my dreams knows my real name. He has scars on his hands, but they don't hurt anymore. He told me not to be afraid when it's time to come home. I slammed the notebook shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. When had he drawn these? How long had this been going on? How had I missed it completely? The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to go to the mosque. I called in sick, something I'd never done in 15 years of service. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the city, trying to outrun the questions circling in my mind like vultures. I found myself parked outside a small church I'd passed thousands of times but never really noticed. It was old, made of red brick with a simple wooden cross mounted above the entrance. People were going in for what looked like a weekday service. Ordinary people, mothers with strollers, elderly men in worn jackets, young couples holding hands. They looked so normal, so peaceful. Before I could stop myself, I was walking toward the entrance. My legs moved without permission, carrying me up the stone steps. I told myself I was just curious, just trying to understand what Yasin might have encountered wherever this had come from. The interior was smaller than our mosque, simpler. No elaborate decorations or Arabic calligraphy, just wooden pews and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the floor. At the front, a man stood speaking about forgiveness, about second chances, about a love that pursued people even when they ran away. I slipped into a back pew, hoping no one would notice me, but as the man continued speaking, his words seemed to reach through the confusion in my mind and touch something I'd forgotten existed. He talked about doubt, about losing faith, about crying out to God when everything fell apart. He talked about a father who watched his son die. When he mentioned the name, Jesus, I flinched as if I'd been struck, but he didn't say it like a battle cry or a weapon. He said it like Yasin had, like it was a person he knew, someone real. Jesus understands your pain, the man said, his voice gentle but certain. He knows what it means to watch love suffer. He knows what it feels like when heaven seems silent. I sat frozen in that pew, surrounded by strangers who sang songs I didn't know, who prayed to someone I'd been taught to keep at arm's length. But for the first time since Yasin died, I didn't feel completely alone. When the service ended, I hurried toward the exit, hoping to escape unnoticed. But a hand touched my shoulder gently, and I turned to find an elderly woman with silver hair and eyes that reminded me of the hospital nurse. "I haven't seen you here before," she said, not unkindly. I struggled for words. My son died. He said, before he died, he said that name. Understanding flickered across her face. Jesus? I nodded, unable to say it myself. And that frightens you. It wasn't a question. Somehow, this stranger could see straight into the chaos of my heart. "I don't understand it," I whispered. "I raised him in our faith. I'm an Imam. I taught him about Allah, about the Quran. I never—" "Maybe," she said quietly. "He was teaching your son about you." I couldn't stop thinking about her voice, as if it knew something I didn't. I drove home in a daze, the old woman's words echoing in my mind. Maybe he was teaching your son about you. What did that even mean? Teaching him what? And why would Jesus care about an imam's family? For the next week, I went through the motions of normal life. I returned to the mosque, led prayers, counseled families, spoke about faith and trust in Allah's plan. But inside, I felt like I was performing a role in a play I no longer understood. The Arabic words that had once flowed naturally now felt foreign on my tongue. When I opened the Quran, the verses seemed to shift and blur before my eyes. My wife, Amira, noticed the change immediately. "You're not sleeping," she said one evening, finding me sitting in Yasin's room again. "You barely eat. The community is starting to talk." "Let them talk." "Ibrahim, this isn't like you. You've always been so strong, so certain. Now you sit in here staring at his things like you're waiting for him to walk through the door." I wanted to tell her about the drawings, about his final word, about the church and the woman with knowing eyes, but how could I explain something I didn't understand myself? How could I tell my wife that our son had apparently been living a secret spiritual life right under our noses? Instead, I just said, "I miss him." She knelt beside my chair and took my hands in hers. "So do I. But he's with Allah now. You taught me to believe that. You taught him to believe that. Don't let grief steal your faith." That night, after Amira fell asleep, I found myself doing something I'd never done before. I opened my laptop and, after making sure the door was locked, typed a single word into the search bar: Jesus. The results overwhelmed me. Millions of pages, videos, testimonies, arguments, historical documents. I clicked randomly, not knowing where to start. Most of it was in English, which I could read but had rarely needed to use for religious purposes. I found myself watching a video of a man telling his story. He'd been a Muslim scholar like me until something happened that changed everything. He spoke about dreams, about visions, about a presence that wouldn't leave him alone. As he talked, describing experiences that sounded impossible, I felt something stir in my chest. Recognition, as if he was describing a country I'd never visited but somehow remembered. Then I found another testimony, a woman who'd lost her child and found comfort in a name she'd never expected to call upon. She described the same peace I'd seen in Yasin's eyes, the same certainty that had both terrified and amazed me. I spent hours watching these stories, these impossible accounts of people who claimed to have encountered something beyond their understanding. They came from different countries, different backgrounds, but they all described the same thing: a presence that was gentle but undeniable, loving but overwhelming, and they all mentioned dreams. That should have been my first warning, but by the time I realized what was happening, it was already too late. The dreams started that very night. I found myself standing in a place I'd never seen, but somehow recognized. It looked like the courtyard of an ancient building, with stone arches and fountains that sparkled in golden light. The air smelled of jasmine and something else I couldn't identify. Something clean and warm and alive. Baba. I turned and there was Yasin, but not as I'd last seen him in the hospital. He looked healthy, whole, radiant. His clothes were white and seemed to glow with their own light. But it was his smile that nearly brought me to my knees. Pure joy, completely untroubled by pain or fear. "Yasin, Habibi, how are you here?" "I told you, Baba. He brought me home." Yasin walked toward me, his movements fluid and graceful. "I've been waiting for you to see." "See what?" Instead of answering, he gestured behind me. I turned and saw a figure approaching from beneath one of the stone arches. Even from a distance, I could feel the power radiating from him, but it wasn't frightening. It was like standing near a fire that warmed without burning, light that illuminated without blinding. As he drew closer, I could make out his features, Middle Eastern like us, with dark hair and kind eyes that seemed to hold depths I couldn't fathom. There were indeed scars on his hands, just as Yasin had drawn, but they pulsed with gentle light rather than pain. "Ibrahim," he said, and his voice was like water after thirst, like music after silence. "I have been waiting to meet you." I wanted to run. Every theological training I'd ever received screamed at me to flee from this blasphemy, this impossible vision. But my feet wouldn't move. And deeper than my fear, stronger than my confusion, was something else. Recognition, as if I was finally seeing someone I'd been searching for my entire life without knowing it. "You took my son," I whispered. "I received him," he corrected gently, "as I will receive you when your time comes. But not yet. There is something you need to understand first." "What?" "That love is not limited by the names we give it. That truth is not contained by the walls we build around it. Your son knew this. That's why he could hear my voice even when you taught him to listen for another." I woke up gasping, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Amira stirred beside me but didn't wake. I stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes looked wild, haunted. It was just a dream, I told myself. Grief playing tricks on my mind. Nothing more. But even as I repeated those words, I could still smell jasmine in the air. Even days later, her words still echoed, and I wasn't sure why. Otvet poisk. The dreams continued for weeks. Every night, I would find myself in that same courtyard, speaking with my son, and the figure whose name I still couldn't bring myself to say aloud. Each conversation left me more shaken than the last, not because of what was said, but because of how right it felt, how natural, how much I looked forward to closing my eyes and returning to that place of impossible peace. During the day, I struggled to maintain my duties at the mosque. My sermons became mechanical, empty recitations of familiar themes. I caught myself staring at the mihrab during prayers, wondering if I was facing the right direction anymore. Not geographically, but spiritually. Everything I'd built my life on felt like it was shifting beneath my feet. One morning, after a particularly vivid dream where Yasin had shown me a garden filled with children speaking every language on earth, I made a decision that terrified me. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what was happening to me, even if it destroyed everything I thought I knew about myself. I drove to a different part of the city, far from anyone who might recognize me, and found a small bookstore. My hands shook as I approached the religious section, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Among the rows of self-help books and philosophy texts, I found what I was looking for: a Bible. I'd studied it academically, of course, as part of my theological training. I knew the arguments against it, the Islamic perspective on its corruption and alterations. But I'd never actually read it as a person seeking answers, as a father trying to understand his son's final word. I bought it with cash, wrapping it in a plain bag like contraband. Back home, I hid it in my study behind other books, waiting until Amira went to visit her sister before I dared to open it. I started with the book called John, remembering that name from one of the testimonies I'd watched. The opening words hit me like a physical blow. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The Word, In Arabic, we would say kalima. I knew this concept, but seeing it presented this way, in this context, made something click in my mind. The Quran spoke of Jesus as Kalimatullah, the Word of God, but I'd always understood it as a title, not as this, not as something so intimate and immediate. I read for hours, absorbed despite myself in stories I thought I knew but had never encountered like this. The Jesus of these pages wasn't the distant figure of Islamic theology. He was immediate, present, touching lepers and eating with sinners, and speaking to people's hearts with an authority that needed no explanation. But it was the crucifixion account that broke me apart. I'd always been taught that it was a deception, that Jesus had been raised to heaven before the crucifixion could take place. Allah would never allow His prophet to suffer such humiliation. But as I read the description of His final hours, something my son had said in the dream came back to me. He understands what it means to watch love suffer. A father watching his son die. The thought hit me so suddenly that I dropped the book. Was that what this was about? Was that why these dreams felt so real? Why Yasin's final word had burned itself into my memory? Because somewhere in the universe, there was a father who knew exactly what I was going through. I picked up the book again, my hands trembling. The crucifixion scene was brutal, unflinching in its description of pain and abandonment. But it was the forgiveness that destroyed me. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Even while dying, he was thinking of others. Even in agony, he was offering mercy. I closed the book and wept until my chest ached. Not from grief this time, but from something else. Something that felt dangerously like recognition. That night, the dream was different. I found myself not in the peaceful courtyard, but in a darker place. A garden where someone knelt alone, praying with such intensity that sweat fell like drops of blood. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his anguish, his desperate plea for another way. But he stayed. Despite the fear, despite the knowledge of what was coming, he stayed. Why? I whispered into the darkness. The figure turned, and I saw his face streaked with tears, because love doesn't abandon what it has chosen to save. But the pain is nothing compared to the joy of bringing children home. I woke with his words burning in my mind. The next day, I couldn't concentrate on anything. During the noon prayer, I found myself unable to remember which surah I was supposed to recite. The Arabic words that had been my native spiritual language for 40 years suddenly felt foreign, inadequate. After the service, old Ahmad, one of the mosque elders, approached me with concern creasing his weathered face. "Brother Ibrahim, are you well? You seem distant lately." "I'm fine," I lied, "still grieving for Yasin." Of course, but the community needs its Imam to be strong. They look to you for guidance. You cannot allow personal sorrow to cloud your spiritual vision. His words stung because I knew he was right. I was failing my responsibilities, letting my congregation down. But I also knew something he didn't. My spiritual vision had never been clearer. It was just pointing in a direction I'd never expected to look. That evening, as I sat in my study with the hidden Bible on my desk, I made a decision that would change everything. I opened to a random page, letting my finger fall where it would. The verse it landed on made my breath catch. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." It wasn't a command or a theological argument. It was an invitation, personal, gentle, direct. For the first time in my adult life, I spoke the name aloud in my empty study, my voice barely above a whisper. Jesus. The room didn't explode. Lightning didn't strike, but something shifted in the air around me. Something so subtle and so profound that I knew I could never go back to pretending it hadn't happened. I couldn't look away. Podalitis export peripisite. That night, I didn't have a dream. Instead, I had an encounter. I'd been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying that moment when I'd spoken his name aloud. The word had hung in the air of my study like incense, refusing to dissipate. Even now, 3 hours later, I could still feel its echo in the room. Beside me, Amira slept peacefully, unaware that her husband was slowly coming apart at the seams. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and padded barefoot to Yasin's room. I'd been avoiding it lately, unable to bear the weight of his absence. But tonight, something drew me there. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and moonlight spilled through his window, casting silver squares across the floor where he used to play. I sat on his bed, running my hands over the blanket Amira still smoothed every morning out of habit. The room smelled faintly of him still, that mixture of soap and boyhood that I'd never thought to memorize while he was alive. "I don't know what you were trying to tell me, Habibi," I whispered to the empty room. "I don't understand any of this." That's when the air changed. It started as warmth, like sitting near a fireplace on a cold night. But this warmth came from inside the room itself, as if the walls had begun to glow with invisible light. I felt my skin prickle, every hair on my arms standing at attention. The silence became different too, not empty, but full, pregnant with something I couldn't name, but recognized in my bones. And then, he was there, not like in the dreams, where I could tell myself it was all in my head. This was different, immediate, undeniable. He stood in the doorway of my son's room, filling the space with a presence so powerful that I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt a peace so complete that it made me want to weep. He looked exactly as he had in my dreams, Middle Eastern features, kind eyes that seemed to hold galaxies, dark hair that caught light from sources I couldn't see. But now I could feel his reality, the weight of his attention, the overwhelming sense that I was known completely and loved without condition. "Hello, Ibrahim," he said, and his voice was like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. I tried to speak, but no words came. I was trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of being in his presence. It was like standing at the edge of an ocean of love so vast that one wave could drown me or wash me clean. "You spoke my name tonight," he continued, stepping into the room. With each step, the warmth increased until I felt it in my marrow. "It's been a long time since you've done that." "A long time?" I managed to whisper. "I've never. Haven't you?" His smile was gentle, patient. "When you were 7 years old, playing in your grandmother's garden, you found an injured bird. You held it in your hands and prayed to whoever was listening to make it well. You didn't know my name then, but you knew my heart. The memory hit me like lightning. I had forgotten it completely. A small boy, a sparrow with a broken wing, desperate tears as I begged any god who cared to help something so small and helpless. The bird had recovered. I told myself it was Allah's mercy, then gradually forgot about it entirely. When Yasin was born, his voice grew softer, and he wasn't breathing at first, and you held him against your chest and begged for his life. Who do you think heard you? I was crying now, silent tears streaming down my face, because I remembered. In that delivery room, watching my son's blue face, I hadn't recited Quranic verses or called on Allah by his 99 names. I'd simply screamed into the void, "Please, please, let him live." And he had lived for 12 beautiful years. "You took him away," I said, the words ripping from somewhere deep in my chest. "I received him," Jesus replied, just as he had in the dream. "Death is not abandonment, Ibrahim. It's homecoming." He moved closer, and I could see that his eyes were wet too. "Do you think I wanted to watch him go? Do you think it brought me joy to see your heart break? Then why? Because some stories can only be told through pain. Some love can only be revealed through loss." He knelt beside Yasin's bed, his presence making the simple furniture seem sacred. "Your son volunteered for this mission before he was ever born. He asked to be the bridge between your old understanding and your new one." I stared at him, struggling to process words that should have sounded insane, but felt like absolute truth. "Mission? To bring you home to me, to show you that love is bigger than the walls we build around it." His hand reached out, hovering just above mine. "May I touch you?" The question broke something in me. After everything he could have demanded, he was asking permission to offer comfort. I nodded, unable to speak. His fingers closed over mine, and the touch was like being plugged into the source of all electricity. Love poured through that connection, not just for me, but through me. I felt his love for every person I'd ever met, every stranger on the street, every enemy I'd ever harbored resentment against. "Do you see?" he whispered. I saw, and it terrified me and set me free at the same time. "What happens now?" I asked. His smile was radiant. "Now you choose. You can return to your old life, your old certainties, or you can follow where love leads you, even when it leads you away from everything you thought you knew about yourself." I looked around Yasin's room, at the prayer rug I'd given him, at the drawings that I now understood were portraits of the figure sitting beside me. "I'm afraid," I whispered. "Good," Jesus said. "That means you understand what you're choosing." The warmth was fading now, but something in my chest had ignited that I knew would never go out. "Will I see you again?" I asked urgently. "Every time you look for me," he promised, "in the spaces between your heartbeats where I have always been waiting." And then he was gone, leaving only the scent of jasmine and the echo of a promise I was finally ready to believe. The next morning, I couldn't pretend anymore. I sat across from Amira at our breakfast table, watching her pour tea with the same graceful movements she'd made for 18 years of marriage. The morning light caught the silver threads in her dark hair, and I realized I was seeing her as if for the first time, not just as my wife, but as a soul created and loved by the same presence that had filled our son's room hours before. How could I tell her? How could I explain that everything we'd built our life on was still true, but not complete? "You look different this morning," she said, settling into her chair with her own cup. "You slept better." I had slept, finally, for 3 hours of the deepest rest I'd experienced since Yasin died. But different didn't begin to cover what had happened to me. "Amira," I began, then stopped. "Where did you start a conversation that might end your marriage?" She looked up from her tea, concern flickering across her features. "What is it?" "I need to tell you something about Yasin's last words." Her face went pale. We'd never spoken about those final moments in detail. It had been too painful, too raw. "Ibrahim, we don't need to..." He said a name. Before he died, he said Jesus. The teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor. Hot liquid splashed across the tiles, but neither of us moved to clean it up. She stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "That's not possible. He was delirious. The medications..." "He wasn't delirious. He was completely lucid, and it wasn't the first time." I pulled out his notebook, opening it to the drawings I'd discovered. "Look at these." Her hands shook as she turned the pages, seeing the figures of light, the outstretched arms, the words written in our son's careful handwriting. "When did he draw these?" "I don't know, but I think he was having dreams or visions. Something was reaching out to him, and we never knew." "No." She pushed the notebook away like it was burning her fingers. "No, this is Shaitan. This is the devil trying to corrupt our grief, make us doubt our faith." "What if it's not?" The question hung between us like a chasm. What if there's something we don't understand? Amira stood abruptly, wrapping her hijab tighter around her head. "I won't listen to this. You're talking about abandoning everything we believe. Our son was a good Muslim boy. He's in paradise with Allah." "I'm not saying he isn't. I'm just saying, maybe there's more to the story than we've been taught." The look she gave me was one I'd never seen before. Part fear, part disgust, part heartbreak. "You're losing your mind. Grief has broken something in you." She was right about something being broken, but I wasn't sure it was my mind. That afternoon, I couldn't concentrate during prayers at the mosque. Every verse I recited felt like it was pointing towards something beyond itself, like the Arabic words were fingers pointing at something I'd never bothered to look at. When I raised my hands in supplication, I found myself wondering if the hands that created the universe looked like the scarred ones I'd touched the night before. After the service, Brother Mahmoud approached me with several other elders. Their expressions were grave, formal. "Ibrahim, we need to speak with you privately." They led me to a small office behind the main prayer hall. The air felt thick, oppressive. I knew what was coming before anyone spoke. "There are concerns," Mahmoud began, his voice carefully measured. "About your recent behavior. Your sermons have been distracted. People are talking." "What kind of talking?" "The kind that questions your fitness to lead this community." Another elder leaned forward. "Your wife came to us this morning. She's worried about your mental state." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Amira had gone to them before even trying to understand what I was experiencing. She says, "You're having strange ideas about your son's death. Dangerous ideas." I looked around the room at these men I'd known for years, had shared meals with, had counseled through their own crises. Now they stared at me like I was a stranger carrying a contagious disease. "What if I told you I saw him?" I said quietly. "What if I told you that the God we worship is bigger than our understanding of him?" The silence that followed was deafening. Mahmoud's face had gone ashen. "If you told us that," he said slowly, "we would have no choice but to remove you from your position. And if I can't stop believing it, then you would no longer be welcome here." The words hung in the air like smoke. I was being given a choice: deny what I'd experienced, or lose everything I'd built my identity around. I thought of Yasin's face in those final moments, the absolute certainty in his young eyes. I thought of the warmth that had filled his room, the love that had poured through me like light through a window. "I need time to think," I said. "You have until Friday," Mahmoud replied. "Either you publicly recommit to Orthodox faith, or we'll find someone else to lead the community." That evening, I sat alone in my study. Amira had taken a bag to her sister's house, saying she needed space to pray about our marriage. The house felt empty without her presence, but also strangely peaceful. Outside, the call to evening prayer echoed across the city. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't answer it. Instead, I closed my eyes and whispered the name that had cost me everything and given me everything in return: Jesus. Friday came with a pale, silent dawn. The city usually woke me with car horns and the metallic cry of vendors, but that morning felt muffled, as if someone had laid a blanket over every sound. I rose before the call to prayer, pulled on Yasin's old hoodie, still faintly scented with his lemon shampoo, and slipped out the door. I didn't leave a note for Amira. Words had been weapons between us all week. Silence felt kinder. A soft wind guided me toward the sea. I'd forgotten how close the shoreline was. 10 winding streets, a crumbling stairway, then sand that squeaked beneath my shoes. The horizon was a single brushstroke of silver, the water breathing in long, unhurried pulses. I walked until the mosque minarets shrank behind me, and the air tasted of salt and cold possibilities. Each step pressed questions deeper into the sand. What is a man when the titles are stripped away? Imam, husband, father. What remains when the congregation turns its face, when even one's own reflection feels like a stranger? I listened for answers in the hiss of the surf, but only my heartbeat responded, steady, unafraid. I stopped where the tide barely touched my toes. The water was winter sharp, yet it felt like an invitation rather than a warning. I let it soak the cuffs of my pants, watch the fabric darken, watch the foam curl and retreat. The sky brightened by slow degrees, clouds peeling back to reveal a shy glow. Not yet sunrise, but a promise of it. In that hush, I realized the ultimatum from the elders no longer mattered. I had already stepped out of the circle they guarded. My next breath would be taken somewhere new, even if my feet never moved again. Memories drifted in like driftwood. Yasin's laugh echoing off playground slides, Amira singing lullabies while stirring soup, my own voice thunderous from the pulpit. None of it dissolved. None of it was wasted. It all simply rearranged itself, like shells after the tide. Same pieces, new pattern. The love inside those memories felt intact, untouched by my change of course, maybe even amplified by it. The wind picked up, cool and clean, carrying a scent I could never place. Jasmine, perhaps, or fresh pages in a long closed book. My skin prickled the way it had in Yasin's room, the night everything changed. I closed my eyes, not to conjure visions, but to rest in whatever might come. No thunder, no choir, just that warmth blooming behind my ribs, as if an unseen hand cupped a candle there, shielding it from every gust. I thought of the elders waiting for my public recantation, of Amira kneeling on her sister's prayer rug, pleading for my soul, of the life I would have to leave unfinished. The grief of it brushed my heart, but did not pierce it. Something stronger pressed outward, easing the ache the way dawn dilutes night. My lips parted, dry from the salt air. The name rose without effort, like air escaping a long, sealed room. Jesus, I whispered. The sea inhaled, exhaled, as if echoing the syllables back to me. I felt no lightning, no earthquake, only the quiet solidity of a step finally taken. My shoulders dropped. Somewhere inside, a locked door clicked open. Tears slipped down, warm against the morning chill, and tasted faintly of salt and relief. I believe. No other words followed. None were needed. The sky blushed pink, the first gulls wheeled overhead, and the water reached once more for my feet, gentle, insistent, as though welcoming me home.